What we're going to do is, again, I'm just recording this so that in case people want to review it, that they can see it afterwards. And then, are we recording now? Okay. So, again, welcome. This is part 6. What we're going to talk about today is dietary fats. So, again, it's one of the ways that, we've all been taught, really, is that we should eat a low-fat diet. And this is starting probably in the 1950s or so, and we've all believed that that would be very healthy for us because we all thought that fat was, clogging up our arteries. And as a result, we followed the very low-fat diet, but the problem is that the benefits have never really materialized, so that we actually had more diabetes, more obesity, and more heart disease than ever before. So it's been increasingly recognized that dietary fats probably are not as bad for us as we initially thought. And this is a quote. Actually, I'm going to use this. This is a quote here from Dr. Hugh and Dr. Willett from the Harvard School of Public Health. He's kind of the head of the nutrition and runs some of these very large studies. And even by about the year 2001, which is about more than 10 years ago, he said, it is now increasingly recognized that the low-fat campaign has been based on little scientific evidence. So we didn't really know what we were doing, but we told people to eat low-fat anyway. So this is the way we think about the obesity, and just to briefly review the previous few lectures. So really the key to the whole part is the insulin, which is really what controls our body weight and how much fat that we have. Cortisol plays a smaller role. It's mostly about the insulin. And over time, what happens is we develop the insulin resistance. And what you can see from this, the way we understand it, is that there are several protective factors that tend to reduce the insulin, which is the fiber and the vinegar. And really, the insulin is the key not only to the weight, but really to the whole spectrum of diseases that we worry about, which is the metabolic syndrome, which is the high blood pressure, the diabetes, the high cholesterol. But not only that, but you can actually link high insulin levels to all these other things: heart disease, cancer, gum disease, all kinds of really, really bad things. And that's one of the reasons that we really worry about the insulin, because it has a major impact on your health. Not in the short term, but over the long term. So if we talk about cholesterol now, this is one of the things that we all do. We measure our cholesterol, we all worry about our cholesterol levels, we all worry about dietary cholesterol. But if you think about what cholesterol actually is, I mean, it's talked about like it's some kind of harmful alien substance, but it's actually not that at all. In fact, it's an essential component of every cell in our body. So every cell in our body has a wall, and this is the so-called plasma membrane. And so you have the phospholipids and also the cholesterol. So all our cells, all the cells in your body, so every part of your body practically, has cholesterol in it. And it, in fact, it's so important to the body that every single cell except the brain, which is very highly specialized, has the ability to make it. So it's not some kind of harmful alien substance like pesticides and chemicals that we eat and that sort of thing. It's actually a vital component of every single cell. And if you eat too little cholesterol, the body simply responds by producing more cholesterol. Because if you look at where we get our cholesterol, 80% of the cholesterol is actually manufactured within our own body. So if you go back to why we kind of worry about fat and cholesterol, it kind of goes back to the 1960s and 70s, when there was a very large debate about whether it was the dietary sugars or the dietary fats that were really important. And one of the really influential people in this debate was this fellow here, Ancel Keys. And he was a scientist at the University of Minnesota, and what he was able to convince people was that it was the dietary fat. So he did several studies, and this is one of the most famous of them, which is the 7 countries study. And what he said was that, well, if you look on the bottom as the fat calories as a percentage of total, and you look at deaths here, you can see that there seems to be a very, very strong correlation with the fat calories. The more fat you ate, the worse you did, the more deaths that happen. And because of that, that's one of the reasons that we all worry about fat. He went on to do several studies, but the main conclusion, so he did this other 7-country study where he took 7 countries and he looked at how much fat they ate and tried to correlate that with how much disease they got. And what he found was, these were his conclusions in 1970. One is that the cholesterol levels predicted the heart disease. 2, the amount of saturated fat in our diet was what was predictive, and that monounsaturated fat protected against heart disease. So from that, you get this kind of idea that you should really, really avoid saturated fats, right? Those were like the worst things, low in saturated fat. That's what we all tried to do. There is also the concept that there's several different types of fat. So polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats became the good fats. So instead of eating, for instance, butter and lard, we would turn to unsaturated fats, such as vegetable oils. So as a result of that, we kind of changed our diets and we went from beef fat and pig fat to vegetable fats. By the 1970s and 1980s, there was a huge war on cholesterol. So it was very popular. At the time, people were kind of blasé about cholesterol, but by the 1980s, it really started getting going. So the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health in the United States, by 1984 said there is no doubt that low-fat diets will afford significant protection against coronary disease. So there is really no doubt in the scientific literature. The president of the American Heart Association at the time said, if everyone went along with cholesterol-lowering program, we will have atherosclerosis conquered by the year 2000. So they thought they could wipe out heart disease, basically, by going on these low-fat, low-cholesterol diets. By the year 2000, everybody would be free of heart disease. Turns out, of course, that wasn't quite true. In fact, we wound up with skyrocketing diabetes, skyrocketing obesity, and more heart disease than ever before. So it didn't quite work out that way. And this is the way we think about fat and cholesterol for the most part. So there's 2 different things. It's the so-called diet-heart hypothesis, which is that the dietary fat and the dietary cholesterol seems to play a big role in cholesterol levels, and the cholesterol level leads to cardiovascular disease. This part, the cholesterol leading to the cardiovascular disease, is called the so-called lipid hypothesis. That is, that's why you get your cholesterol checked all the time. And the way to lower your cholesterol through the diet is to reduce your dietary fat, which actually, even if you think about it, makes very little sense, since cholesterol is 80% manufactured by the body. Attacking that 20% really is very little. The other problem, of course, is that as you reduce your diet, the cholesterol in your diet, of course, the body will make more to compensate. So this is the so-called diet-heart hypothesis. So 1, cholesterol is associated with cardiovascular disease, so the lipid hypothesis. 2, saturated fat increases cholesterol, therefore dietary fat increases cardiovascular disease. And that's the way we kind of all think about dietary fats these days. The problem with that is that we can look at what happened, and we can actually start to see that it wasn't quite as tidy as it seemed. So if we start with the lipid hypothesis, so if you think about the cholesterol, we all believe that high cholesterol leads to increasing death. So most of the data comes from the Framingham study, but the problem is when you actually start to look back at total cholesterol and mortality, like the risk of death, it doesn't seem to be as robust as it initially did. So this is the Framingham data. So this is the original data when you look back and go back to what the original data was. And if you look, they break it down by age. So these people down here, these people are the younger, for age 40, age 50, age 60, age 70, and age 80. And what you can see is that as the cholesterol tends to go up, there seems to be a small rise in mortality, small rise in your death. But as you get older, there seems to be very little benefit. So 40 and 50-year-olds might show a little bit of an increased risk in death with higher cholesterol. But by the time you get about age 60, you can see it's flat. There doesn't seem to be any increased risk of death with higher cholesterol. By the time you get to age 80, you can see that the high cholesterol is not bad for you at all. It's actually very, very good for you. That is, if you look at these people, the ones with the lowest cholesterol are the ones that are dying off like crazy. And as you get higher and higher cholesterol, you get lower and lower risks of death, which is not exactly what people sell you. Since most of the risk of death is in these older folks, the cholesterol actually isn't a very good predictor of death at all. And what's further is that people have been able to follow the same group of people over 14 years. And what they found is that the falling cholesterol isn't a good thing. It's actually a very, very bad thing. So if you start out with a high cholesterol and then 14 years down the line your cholesterol is lower, most of you would probably think that's a good thing. But in fact, your risk of death would actually skyrocket. For every 1 millimole you drop, so if your cholesterol goes from 5 to 4 14 years later, you're not doing better. Your risk of death is increased by 429%. It is a huge risk. A low cholesterol is actually bad for you, not the high cholesterol. This is total cholesterol. They've broken it down since between the good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. But nevertheless, this is what happens. If you look at women, you can see the same sort of pattern. So they've broken this down again by age. So this is the group with that's age less than 55. And you can see that as you get a higher cholesterol, you do get a higher risk of death. The two lines here is one group, and then they lagged it by 9 years. So they followed up 9 years later. And then if you look at the group that is age over 55, again, as your cholesterol goes up, your risk of death doesn't go up. It goes down. And the risk of death is much, much higher in these people over the age of 55. So what happens is that the risk is actually significantly higher if your cholesterol is low, which is the exact opposite of what we think, right? And the exact opposite of why we do our cholesterols every year. And this is the Framingham Heart Study. This is the study that we base all of our medical decisions on. And this is follow-up over 31 years. So the high cholesterol is protective, not detrimental. If you look at a study from Norway, so this is 52,000 patients from Norway. They followed them up over 10 years, and then they basically wanted to look at the risk of death associated with each level of cholesterol. So again, they broke it down by men and women, and you can see for men, it seems to be flat. As you get higher and higher cholesterol, well, at first there seems to be a protective effect, then it disappears, so it's about flat. But for women, you can see that as you get higher and higher cholesterol, your risk of death actually keeps going down and down. Okay? Not up and up, but goes down and down as your level of cholesterol goes up. And this is a study very recently from the MONICA, which is a World Health Organization kind of survey from 19 European nations. And what you can see is this. There doesn't really seem to be any correlation at all. This is the percentage of the population with high cholesterol. So these people have these countries have a lot of high cholesterol, and these countries have very low levels of high cholesterol. And what you can see is that there's really no correlation between the death rate from heart disease and the cholesterol at all. Some are high, some are low, but there's really no discernible pattern at all. So people like, for instance, in Lithuania have a very high death rate and a moderate amount of high cholesterol, but right next to it you have a country like Germany where they have a low death rate and virtually the same amount of high cholesterol. So there doesn't really seem to be much correlation at all. So the lipid hypothesis, which is that the cholesterol is highly predictive of these cardiovascular events, doesn't seem to be true at all. And one of the main drugs that we use is the statin. So this is, cholesterol-lowering pills. So there's two major classes, a newer class called ezetimibe, but the main class that we use is called statins. And that's always been one of the major things, because the use of these statins seems to lower risk of heart disease. And that part is not really controversial. There's many, many studies. So these cholesterol-lowering pills actually protect us from heart disease. And that's always been held up as one of the major reasons we believe this lipid hypothesis. But it turns out that these so-called cholesterol-lowering pills actually have many, many more effects other than lowering cholesterol. They actually have effects all over the cell. So part of what they do is attack the LDL, but they also have multiple effects on VCAM, ICAM, which are different signaling molecules. They have effects on CRP, which is a measure of inflammation. So they have lots of different effects. So simply the fact that these drugs lower cholesterol and they reduce heart disease is not the same as saying that the cholesterol is the reason that they reduce heart disease. So we go to the next part of the diet-heart hypothesis, which is the dietary fat part of things, right? So we see that the cholesterol leading to heart disease part, that's not quite on as strong ground as we might believe. But the next part is that does the diet have any influence on the serum cholesterol? So this is where Framingham is. It's in Massachusetts, and basically what they did is they took this whole town, and Harvard University set it up in 1948, a study where they're going to take everybody, practically as many people as they can in this little town, and they're going to check them every couple of years and see who gets heart disease and who doesn't get heart disease. And the reason they set up this test was really to find the relationship between dietary fat and heart disease. And so they looked at these people, and what they found was that there actually was a considerable range in the serum cholesterol. Okay, so some people had high cholesterol, some people had low cholesterol. But this is what's important. This is Tavia Gordon from the National Institute of Health. He is the main statistician in charge of the study. He says, something explains this inter-individual variation, but it is not diet. That is, some people have high cholesterol, some people have low cholesterol, but what causes that high and low cholesterol is not your diet. It's not your dietary fat, it's not your dietary cholesterol. And that again is contrary to the message that we mostly get, which is that your cholesterol level is due to your diet. In fact, that has almost no correlation to the diet. And this was known more than 50 years ago. So when they found this out, they actually couldn't believe it. So they wound up never publishing it, even though this study was a huge study and everybody's looking forward to it. And this was the only paper that got kind of published, and this is not published in a medical journal where it was distributed widely. They published it in a little folder, and then they filed it away, and it got lost somewhere. So they said that Tavia Gordon says, unfortunately, these data were never incorporated in a definitive report, and that's the reason why we don't know this. But if you look at the articles in the newspaper that came out around the same time, what you can see is that there is no discernible relationship between the diet intake and the serum cholesterol levels. So even if you were to believe that the cholesterol levels were really, really important, the diet doesn't really seem to make much difference to the serum cholesterol levels. So this is what it showed. So they took men and women, and they looked at the cholesterol, how much cholesterol they actually ate. And then they looked at the cholesterol levels. And you see, if you ate above median, so if you ate a lot of cholesterol, your level of cholesterol was 6.16. If you ate very little cholesterol, your cholesterol level was 6.16. There just doesn't seem to be any relationship at all. You could eat a lot of cholesterol, you could eat a little cholesterol. Your cholesterol level won't change. And that makes sense because most of the cholesterol in your body is actually manufactured by the body. And that's actually one of the ways that those drugs, those statin drugs, work to lower cholesterol, is that they block the manufacture of cholesterol in the body. And that's why they're far more effective than the diet at lowering cholesterol. But the diet is not nearly what we think it is. There's no association between the cholesterol and the dietary cholesterol and the serum cholesterol levels, and there's also no association between the fat and the cholesterol levels. So neither of those really makes a difference. But because they kind of buried the result, never published it, it never got out to the rest of the public that it wasn't, the diet simply wasn't that important. And no matter how much we look, we couldn't find any kind of relationship between dietary fat and dietary cholesterol. So this is another study
called the Tecumseh study, which again you can look at. They looked at serum cholesterol levels. They took a group of people and they looked at people with high cholesterol, kind of medium levels of cholesterol, and they looked at people with low cholesterol. So lower tertile means the lowest, the 1/3 of people that have the lowest cholesterol. And they looked at the amount of fat they ate, the amount of percentage of calories from fat and cholesterol. And you can see that whether or not you ate, whether or not you had high, middle, or low cholesterol, the amount of fat you ate and the amount of cholesterol was very similar. So if you look at cholesterol, for instance, 554, 566, 533, they're all very similar. So there, again, is no influence of dietary fat or dietary cholesterol on your serum cholesterol levels. It simply doesn't seem to make any difference. So in fact, the National Cholesterol Education Program, which is a program run in the United States, actually knows this. They just don't really want to tell you. So what they write when you kind of dig through their huge reports on cholesterol is that dietary cholesterol causes marked hypercholesterolemia in many laboratory animals, including non-human primates. High intakes of cholesterol in humans, however, do not cause such a marked increase in serum cholesterol. So when you do studies on chimpanzees and stuff, and you give them a lot of cholesterol, their cholesterol levels will go up. Humans, though, it doesn't seem to make any difference. In other words, if you're a non-human primate, you should definitely avoid dietary cholesterol. Humans, though, not so much. It doesn't seem to make any difference. And here's the really, so this is the part of the diet heart hypothesis that we're really interested in. Is there a link between dietary fat and cardiovascular disease? Because it doesn't matter what the intermediary is. It doesn't matter if it affects the cholesterol or not. But really what we're interested in is, does dietary fat cause cardiovascular disease? Because if it does, and most of us do believe that it does, then you should lower dietary fat. The problem is that it probably doesn't. So this is the original data from Ansel Keys. So this seemed to be very, very important. So look at the bottom, it's fat calories as a percentage of total. So as you eat more fat as a percentage, your risk of heart disease and your risk of death goes up. So that was always kind of the backbone of our belief that fat was bad for you. But he actually cherry-picked the data quite substantially to exaggerate how close the relationship actually is. So he actually started with 22 countries, and then he kind of just threw out the ones that didn't seem to fit, and then he got a much cleaner graph. So this is the original graph. You see that there's a much larger spread. It's not a nice, simple line like that. Eat more calories from fat, therefore you get more heart disease. It's actually much more messy than that. And you can see that there still seems to be some kind of relationship. That is, the more calories from fat you take, the higher your risk of death. But it's not nearly as good as it seemed to be from the way he originally presented it. But if you go back and look at the life expectancy, so if you say, okay, well, let's look at how long people live compared to the percentage calories of fat, you can see that contrary to what you would expect, that is, as you take more fat, so this is fat intake, percentage percent of total calories, and this is life expectancy, you can see that it actually goes up slightly to the right. That is, the higher percentage of fat in your diet, the longer your life expectancy. So this seems to be a bit of a paradox here, because if you're saying that the more fat you eat, the more heart disease you get, yet you're saying that the more fat you eat, the higher your life expectancy. You live longer. Well, you live longer, but you have more heart disease. Well, the confounder here is really industrialization, because if you go back and look at industrialization, so as you turn from a kind of agrarian-based society or primitive society, you go from people who don't eat a lot of dietary fat to more. So really the confounder here is, if you look at GDP per capita, so the so-called industrialized nations, they tend to have more heart disease and they tend to have more fat. But it doesn't mean that one caused the other. It's really just a reflection of the fact that these are first world nations. So you can see that as people get more affluent, as they become kind of
United States, Western Europe, Canada, as opposed to sub-Saharan Africa, you eat more percentage of calories of fat. And therefore, not only do you have more fat, but you have a higher life expectancy, as well as increased coronary artery disease. So in fact, it doesn't show you anything at all. The association between the heart disease and the fat doesn't show you anything at all. All it shows you is that we're living in an industrialized society. So we have more heart disease, but we have a longer life expectancy. And that kind of explains the paradox behind it. So this association between fat and heart disease kind of is not quite real. As in, they tried to make it causal, it's an association. They tried to make it as if one caused the other, but it really wasn't anything of the sort. It simply reflected the fact that some countries were industrialized and some countries were not. And that's the downfall of that. And no matter how hard we looked for this link between saturated fat or total fat and heart disease, we actually couldn't find any link. So there's been a number of studies. So this is a listing of several of the studies. So all the way back to the 1960s. So the 1960s, they looked at 2,000 patients and they followed them over 4 years. They couldn't find any link to dietary fat. In the 1970s, they did a few more studies, very large studies, 7,000 patients, and then in the 80s, there's a 10,000 patient study, and then again here in the 1980s, 2,000 patients, and they followed them over 20 years. And again, over 20 years, this paper, and they could find no correlation between coronary artery disease and either fat or saturated fat. So over the past 50 years, we've kept looking and looking and looking for this link, trying to prove this link between dietary fat and heart disease, and it simply couldn't be found. And it probably couldn't be found because it really wasn't there. What we thought was the link was really just kind of a phantom because it was just the difference between first world nations and third world nations. That was all it was. But there was no real link between dietary fat and heart disease, and we couldn't find it anywhere. So we can look at these very large studies. This is the Nurses' Health Study, which takes 80,000 nurses, okay, and follows them over 14 years. And they want to see who gets heart disease and who doesn't. And these are very, very large studies run out of Harvard, very influential studies. And these were one of the studies that actually pointed to the risk of heart disease with trans fats. So these are man-made fats, and they were actually very, very bad for you. But when you adjust for the trans fats, so you take the trans fats out of it, so the trans fats were bad for you, and that seemed to be driving a lot of the problems. But this is you divide the nurses into quintiles, that is 1/5. So this is the risk of heart disease, and it's the top 1/5, and the Q4 is the second, and this is the lowest. So if you look at your fat intake, so these are the people that eat the most fat, and these people are the ones that eat the least fat. And 1.0 means that the risk is the same. And so I've drawn the line here in red, and what you can see is that really whether you eat a lot of fat or whether you eat very little fat, your risk of heart disease is essentially unchanged. So total fat intake was not significantly related to the risk of heart disease. In other words, it doesn't matter how much fat you ate. When you adjust for trans fats, if you ate a lot of trans fats, for sure you're going to do badly. But if you look at other fats, it just was not relevant. Okay, and these are huge studies. It's 80,000 person study. Okay, there's no relationship whatsoever short of the trans fats. If you look at cholesterol, again, it's the same. So these are the people who ate the most cholesterol, and these are the people who ate very little cholesterol. So you can see, again, there's very little difference between whether you ate, say, the second, so very little cholesterol, or a lot of cholesterol. So whether you ate a lot or a little bit, it just doesn't seem to matter. So the amount of cholesterol that you eat and the amount of fat that you eat in the diet has really very little bearing on your risk of coronary heart disease. It doesn't clog up your arteries. It's not like you eat a lot of fatty foods and it clogs up your arteries. There's no relationship then that we can find. And this is, again,
showing over the years, this is the cholesterol intake. So our cholesterol intake as a population has not changed much over the last 100 years. But the risk of heart disease goes up, it goes down. But there's something that's causing that. But it's simply not the cholesterol. The cholesterol that in our diets is not that relevant. So recently, a couple of years ago, the Archives of Internal Medicine published a study. So these people looked at basically all the dietary studies they could find and tried to see what is important in the diet and what is not important in the diet. So they wanted to look at all factors, including Mediterranean diet. So these are the ones that seem to make a difference. Okay, so if you follow a Mediterranean diet, it was very good, because if you look at coronary outcomes, it's 63%. What that means is that if you follow a Mediterranean diet, you have only 63% of the risk of heart disease of somebody not, which means that you have about a 30% protection from heart disease by following a Mediterranean diet. So that's good. A Mediterranean diet, which is actually higher in fat, olive oil and so on, and tends to be lower on processed foods. High quality diet, which is defined differently, but vegetables, for instance, carries about a 23% protection. If you look at nuts, nuts are very high in fat, right? It's half fat and half protein, a lot of these things. But if you eat a lot of nuts, you see you get about a 30%, because it's a 0.7, which means you have 70% of the risk. In other words, you have 30% protection if you eat a lot of nuts. If you eat trans fats, of course, that's very bad, because you get 1.3, which means you have a 30% increase in risk if you eat a lot of trans fats. And if you eat a high glycemic index or high glycemic load, which is, you know, what we've been talking about, which is foods that are highly processed, which tend to raise the insulin levels, again, you have a 30% higher risk of heart disease when you take those. So those we can understand. But what about the dietary fat? That's what we're really interested in this session. Well, you can see that whether you look at total fat, saturated fat, or unsaturated fat, all of these cluster around 1.0. What that means is that there's no difference. 1.0 is 100%. So if you take a lot of saturated fat, you have about the same risk of heart disease as somebody who doesn't take saturated fat. So saturated fat, which has been demonized all this time, simply has no correlation when you actually look at all the studies. It's not just one study, but it's 11 studies. 11 studies they've looked at all this time, and saturated fat was simply not a factor in any of them. So no matter how you look, no matter how you slice it, you could not find any correlation between saturated fat. And the unsaturated fat, which is the vegetable oils and all those, corn oil, canola oil, which we all thought was very healthy for you, it carries no protection at all. That is, if you take a lot of these vegetable oils, it doesn't seem to do you any good. And if you take a lot of saturated fat, it doesn't do you any harm. So again, if you look at the National Cholesterol Education Program, so this is that big program run out of the United States, what you can see is that they've really found, so recent prospective studies have failed to detect a causative link between percentage of dietary fat and obesity. In other words, despite 40, 50 years of trying to find the evidence that dietary fat is really, really bad for us, they still haven't been able to find it. And the reason they probably haven't been able to find it is that it's simply not there. So let's look at saturated fat, because this is the one that everybody is warned against, right? So trans fats are a different category entirely. So trans fats are saturated fats, but they're man-made and they're very, very bad for you, and nobody really doubts that. And we all try and eat less trans fats. But what about saturated fats? So these are the fats that are found in a lot of, you know, meat, for instance, cheese, eggs. And this is the reason why a lot of us try to avoid all these things. So saturated fats are fats that are fully saturated with hydrogen. And it's a chemical term. But what it means is that they're much less likely to spoil. So unsaturated fats have kind of empty hydrogens, and they can go rancid. And that's the reason food manufacturers don't like polyunsaturated fats. Because if you make foods with them, and you try and leave them on the shelf, they actually go bad very quickly. But saturated fats, like beef fat and lard and so on, they don't go bad very quickly. And that's the reason why food manufacturers like to use saturated fat. When the tide kind of turned against all these natural saturated fats, they took vegetable oils and saturated them. And that's how they made trans fats. They're turning an unsaturated fat into a saturated fat, increased the shelf life and all this sort of stuff, but the problem was that they were really, really bad for you. But if you look at saturated fats, these are the fats that you see in beef tallow and butter, for instance. So all these animal fats that we've been warned against. You can see the blue here is the amount of saturated fats, and the amount of yellow and orange, these are unsaturated fats. So some are monounsaturated, which is the orange, and some are omega-6s, which is this. So if you look at cottonseed oil or corn oil, and most vegetable oils show very much the same thing, you can see that mostly it's omega-6s, as opposed to the animal fats, which tends to be saturated fats. And that's the reason that we kind of switched away, for instance, from lard, which is pig fat. If you look at the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, you can see that they're much different between the animal fats, which is here. So they tend to have a lot of they tend to have very little omega-6, but a lot of saturated fat, compared to these corn oil, for instance, or cottonseed oil, which has a lot of omega-6s in them. If you look at how much animal fat we've been consuming over the years, you can see that it was pretty steady up until the 1940s, 1950s, something like that, and then we started to get warned against saturated fat, and you can see that we've been eating a lot less. Recently, of course, there's been increasing recognition that some of these fats are actually not bad for you at all. And you can see that recently the intake of saturated fat has been increasing over the last few years. And as a corollary, the vegetable oil, so the corn, canola, all those sort of oils that we've been told to eat more of, you can see since the 1950s and 60s, they've really just kind of skyrocketed. And we did this because we thought the saturated fat was bad and the vegetable oil was good. So we should actually switch this for our health. We ate margarine instead of butter. We switched to vegetable oil instead of lard, and that sort of thing. When you look at the health professional study, so this is, again, health professionals such as physicians and nurses and so on, and this is run out of Harvard University again. They took 43,000 health professionals and monitored them over 6 years. And they wanted to know the question again, is saturated fat really bad for you? So they took all these people and they broke them down into quintiles. So this is the group that ate very, very little saturated fat. Okay, so they're quintile 1. And this is the group that ate the most saturated fat, the ones that are eating all that butter and eggs and bacon and all that. And this is 1.0, which is the reference level, and this is the risk of heart disease, the risk of a heart attack. And you can see that if you eat very little saturated fat compared to the most saturated fat, your risk of heart disease doesn't go up. It actually goes down. That is, the highest risk you have are the people who eat the least saturated fat. In other words, the saturated fat was not bad for you, but it was actually protective. It was protective against heart disease. And what they said here, and this is not new data, this was published in 1996, so this is data that's close to 15, 18 years old. We've known about this data forever. What it says is that these data do not support the strong association between intake of saturated fat and risk of heart disease. If you look at other studies, for instance, this was published in 1985. This is looking at dietary fat and stroke. So they took almost 8,000 Japanese men who are healthy. They looked at their diet, and you followed them up over 10 years and said, well, who's going to get a stroke and who's not going to get a stroke? So they looked at 3 factors. The blue is the fat, the red is the protein, and the green is the sodium. So you can see that Q1 is the first quintile, which means that they eat the least fat of all. And Q5 is the top quintile, which means that they ate the most fat. So again, if you go back and look at the 10-year stroke incidence, as you eat more and more fat, your risk of stroke doesn't go up. it goes down. In other words, the fat, the dietary fat, is not bad for you. It's actually highly protective. If you look at protein, it actually shows the same thing. So the people who eat the least protein actually have the highest risk. So as you eat more and more protein, your risk actually goes down. For sodium, we think salt is really, really bad for stroke. But if you look at sodium, compared to the lowest, if you compare the lowest people who eat the least salt compared to the people who eat the most salt, there's actually no difference in risk. The salt wasn't bad for you at all. Okay, so this is heart disease, we have this data. Also stroke, we have this data. More recently, there was another look at these people to look at dietary fat and stroke. And this was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1997. So a little bit more recent. Those were that study was published in the 1980s, and these studies are published in the 1990s. And this is actually data from the Framingham study, which is the study that we all look at. We all think is what shows that fat is really bad for you. And this is 20-year follow-up. So they've taken people and they followed them for 20 years, and they said who gets a stroke, who doesn't get a stroke. And they again break them down into 5 groups, one which eats the most amount of fat and one which eats the least amount of fat. So what you see is this. If you are this group which eats the lowest amount of fat, this is your risk of stroke. Up here, 15% or so. Compared to the people who eat the most fat, which is down here, which is somewhere around 5% or so. In other words, if you look at the people who ate the most fat, compared them to the ones who eat the least fat, the people with the least fat have almost a 3 times higher risk of stroke. Okay, now that's completely opposite of what most of us believe. The other interesting thing is that relationship holds up for the total fat. It holds up for saturated fat, which we think is bad, but it's not. It's actually protective. And it holds up for monounsaturated fat, which is one of the other fats that you see in a lot of the animal fats. But what is not protective is the polyunsaturated fats, the vegetable oils. Okay, so the one oil that we thought was good for you, the one fat we thought that was good for you, had no protective association at all. If you look at heart disease, this was a more recent study in 2004. And what they did was they took 200 women. And you know how they do the angiogram? They put the catheter up, they put it in and take pictures of the arteries of the heart, and they see how much blockage there is. Well, they took these women and they followed them up. So 3 years later, they took pictures again and saw how much of the artery is completely blocked up. And what they did was they tried to correlate that with different types of fat. So this is saturated fat in the black bar. So you can see this is the quartile. So they broke them into quarters. These people who eat the lowest amount of fat and these people who ate the most amount of fat. Okay, so the people who ate the least fat, okay, the lowest amount of saturated fat, they had the most clogging of their arteries. That is, the amount of opening of the artery went down a lot. Compared to the people who ate the most saturated fat, their arteries seemed to open up a little bit. So rather than all this fat clogging your arteries, when you eat the fat, it doesn't clog your arteries, it seems to clean out the arteries. And if you look at the monounsaturated fat, so monounsaturated is the one that's in a lot of animal fats, but is in a lot of like the avocados and the olive oils and stuff. That also shows a slight protective effect, but if you look at the vegetable oils, this one, the polyunsaturated fat, it is not protective at all. If you eat a lot of unsaturated fat, vegetable oil, you get the most clogging of your arteries. Okay, so the one fat that we thought was good for you, the corn oil, the canola oil, those vegetable oils, they're not good for you. And what you thought was bad for you, which is the saturated fat, which is the lard, it actually is very good for you. Okay, completely opposite of what you would have expected. And if you think back about lard is very interesting actually, because 60, 70 years ago, everybody used to eat lard, which was pig fat. Like they'd take the drippings off a pig and they'd sell it in a big bucket of Crisco or whatever like that. And it was all pig fat. And we thought, wow, that's super bad for you. So, you know, starting in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we all switched to vegetable oil instead. And Crisco couldn't sell pig fat. They switched over to a vegetable oil lard. But what's interesting, of course, is that back in the 30s and 40s, when they were eating all this pig fat, of course, they really had very little heart disease whatsoever. And it isn't until we started eating all the vegetable oils that we started getting bad. Yet we think that pig fat and lard is just like the worst thing for you ever, right? McDonald's used to cook all their French fries in beef tallow, which was beef fat, which made it taste really good, but then everybody thought it was really bad for you. But now they cook it in vegetable oil, which is probably what is really bad for you. And then further studies, again, more recent studies, this is in 2005, looking at dietary fat and heart disease. And this is the so-called Malmo diet and cancer study, which was done in Sweden. And what you can see is that saturated fat shows no correlation to heart disease at all in men. And if you look at women, this is the same sort of thing. You take 30,000 men and women, you follow them over 6.5 years and see who gets heart disease and who doesn't. So as you eat more and more fat, you can see your risk goes down and down. Okay? And this leads to the so-called French paradox. And for many years, this was one of the things that people didn't understand. Okay? So, and the French paradox goes kind of like this. The French, who actually now eat a lot of fast food, but back then in the kind of 80s and 90s, they were eating butter, and they were eating cheese, and they were eating pork, and they were eating pork rinds, and foie gras, which is all fat, right? So they were eating all this saturated fat. And so if you look at total fat, it was, the French ate more, but if you look at animal fat, the French ate a heck of a lot more than Americans. And yet if you look at the rate of heart disease deaths, the Americans were like way higher. And this was the so-called French paradox. It was a paradox because they couldn't understand why the French could eat so much saturated fat and yet not have any heart disease at all. Well, the answer is fairly clear. There was no paradox at all. The saturated fat was not actually bad for you. And that's why the French were eating so much of the saturated fat and yet were seemingly way healthier. They didn't have the obesity, they didn't have the heart disease, they didn't have the problems. And they were smoking like chimneys too, right? So the whole thing was a paradox at the time, but there was no paradox at all. If you look more recently, this was published in 2012 in the British Journal of Nutrition, and what you can see is this. They took a number of European countries and they looked at heart disease and saturated fat. So this is total energy from saturated fat. So as you go up this way, you eat more and more saturated fat. This is the rate of heart disease deaths. Okay, this is heart disease. And what you can see is when you plot all the countries in Europe and Central Asia, as you start to eat more and more saturated fat, you don't get more heart disease, you get less heart disease. And as you start to eat less and less saturated fat, you get more and more heart disease. So in fact, it seems that the saturated fat is quite protective against heart disease. And this is in 2009, Dr. Krauss, who used to be the past head of the American Heart Association, he looked at basically all the studies again. So he took all the studies that he could find and tried to look at heart disease and saturated fat. And again, what you can see is that if you take all the studies all together that have kind of ever been done that he could identify, it falls on this line. This line means that there's no harm and no benefit to saturated fat. In terms of stroke, there seems to be a highly significant protective effect. But when you look at the total, there seems to be no harm at all. So really, from all these studies that have ever been done in the last 50 years, so he took 21 studies covering 347,000 patients. When you look at all the studies that have ever been done anywhere, you simply can't find any link of saturated fat and heart disease. But you can find that it is highly protective against stroke. This is the Japanese. So like, we've been talking about Europe and Asia a lot, but again, if you take a look at this cohort, so you take 58,000 Japanese people, and you follow them over 14 years, you see who gets heart disease, who doesn't get heart disease. Again, this is looking at three things: stroke, heart attack, and total cardiovascular event. And these are the quintiles. So again, these are the people that eat the most saturated fat, and these are the people that eat less. So again, whether you're looking at stroke in the blue or heart attacks in the red, as you eat more and more fat, you get less and less heart disease and less stroke. Your risk continuously goes down. If you eat a little bit of saturated fat, you have a little bit of protection. If you eat a lot of saturated fat, you get a lot of protection. Okay, so it's not simply isolated data. And then you can talk about different types of fat. So this is looking at so-called palmitoleic acid, which is actually the fat that's found in whole fat dairy. So, high-fat cheeses and so on. So we all try to eat these low-fat cheeses. Everybody says, oh, eat low-fat dairy, okay? So don't drink whole milk, drink skim milk. Don't eat the high-fat cheese, eat the low-fat cheese. Well, here's the risk of diabetes. So this is, again, the top group. So this is quintile 5, which means that they eat the most amount of this dairy fat. And these are the people that eat the least amount of this dairy fat. And again, as you eat more and more of the fat, your risk of diabetes keeps going down. Okay? It's not bad for you. The high-fat dairy is not bad for you. It's good for you. If you look at measures of inflammation like CRP, this is a measure of insulin resistance. Again, as you eat more and more of this dairy fat, your risk of inflammation and your risk of diabetes continuously goes down. It's good for you. The saturated fat is good for you. If you look at eggs, and we're all worried about eggs because you throw out the yolk, because you don't worry about the dietary cholesterol. Again, if you look at the risk of heart disease and compared to the number of eggs that you consume, again, you can see, you compare people who eat less than 1 per week eggs, and you set that as a reference level. And as you eat more eggs, so people who eat more than 1 egg a day, again, they don't have more risk of heart disease. They have less. So all those egg yolks and stuff, you've been avoiding eggs this whole time and eating bread and toast for breakfast, it's not good for you. You should have been eating that egg. You should have been eating all that fat all along. That low-fat dairy that you thought was good for you, the skim milk which you thought was good for you. No, you should have been eating the high-fat cheese and the high-fat dairy and the eggs. You should have been eating that all along. So more and more studies come out showing this exact same thing. So this was just published in 2013, the British Medical Journal. They looked at, again, all the studies that have ever been done on eggs. And what you found is that there's no correlation. So it falls right on 1.0. This is the overall. When you look at all the studies that have ever been done on eggs, there doesn't seem to be any correlation between the number of eggs you eat and heart disease. If you look at diabetes, so they looked at all different types of eggs and compared them, the people who eat more than 1 egg a day to the ones that eat less than 1 egg per week. And you can see that it makes no difference for most of these measures, but in terms of the diabetes, you get a lot more diabetes if you cut out the eggs and the dairy. So the nuts is the same thing. So there's been multiple studies, about 5 or 6 studies that have shown that nuts are actually very protective. Okay, so most people know this, walnuts and other nuts. If you take a lot of nuts, you're protected against heart disease. And you can see that people who almost never eat nuts to people who almost eat daily nuts, their risk actually goes down as you eat more and more nuts. So, almost down to 60%. So you're talking about a 30 to 40% reduction in your risk in those people who eat a lot of nuts. And we've always said don't eat a lot of nuts because they're high in fat. Well, that's good. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Nuts are actually very interesting because they're high in fat, which is good. They're high in fiber, which is very good. And they're high in protein, which is very good. And what they don't have a lot of is carbohydrates, and they don't tend to raise the serum insulin levels. So they are actually very good. And of course, recently we've talked about omega-3s in terms of fat. So these are the fats that are found in a lot of fish and oily fish, salmon, mackerel, that kind of thing. And most of you know that there's been a big interest in people, like populations who eat a lot of fish seem to have a lot of protection against heart disease. And these are, again, fats, omega-3 fats. It's a specific type of unsaturated fat. So as opposed to the omega-6s, which you find in all the seed oils, the omega-3s seem to be highly protective. And there's a few studies of this. Most people know that it seems to be protective already, but you can take these 18,000 Japanese patients and you give some of them EPA, which is an omega-3, and some of them you don't. And those ones that you gave the omega-3 supplements to seem to do better. They seem to have less heart disease. So the amount of protection is actually fairly substantial. It seems to be about a 20% reduction in risk. When you give these kind of normal people with high cholesterol but no heart disease, when you give them omega-3s, they do seem to protect the heart. And that's where this whole notion comes from. The low-fat diet, of course, has been studied. And of course, what they found is that if you have a heart attack and you give somebody a low-fat diet, it doesn't really seem to be protective at all. So this is a very early study published in 1989. And they showed that if you take 2,000 men after a heart attack and you randomize them, one to a low-fat diet, one to a regular diet, there's really no difference. There's no protection in the low-fat diet. But what seems to protect them a lot is the fish. So people who they told to eat fish twice a week, they seem to have a lot less. This is the percentage surviving. So you can see they had a lot better survival than the people who didn't eat a lot of fish. So a lot of people believe that that might be due to the fatty fish, and particularly the omega-3s. So the one fat that is, of course, very bad for you is trans fat. So trans fats are man-made fats, and they used to be found in a lot of margarines. Margarines have, switched, and this was due to Dr. Willett, who did the big studies on the Nurses' Health Study, and they found that these artificial trans fats are actually very, very bad for you. So back in the day, we switched from margarine because we thought it was a lot better for you compared to butter, because butter had all that saturated fat. But it turns out that when you look at people who eat a lot of margarine, compared them to this one, which is the coronary heart disease event, so heart attacks and so on, as you ate more and more margarine, your risk of having these heart disease is substantially higher. What's interesting, though, is the butter. So as you eat more and more butter, you see that the slope actually goes the other way. So as you eat more and more butter, which is all the saturated fat, your risk of heart disease does not go up, it actually starts to go down. So again, saying that it's probably protective for you. So what we thought was protective is the polyunsaturated fat, the vegetable oils. And this is what's happened over the last 50 years or so. The total fats has slowly gone up, but it hasn't been the animal fats. It's been the vegetable oils. So as we eat more and more of this corn oil and canola oil and sunflower oil and all that sort of thing. If you look at butter and margarine, you can see what's happened to butter consumption. It's kind of fallen off quite substantially. And we've replaced that with margarine, which is all vegetable oil. So basil and all these sort of things have all been doing that. This is the polyunsaturated fat, so it mirrors the consumption of vegetable oil. That is, we've switched from eating lard to vegetable oil. And if you look at polyunsaturated fatty acid, our consumption has kind of steadily been going up through all these years. And we all think that it's not a processed food, that vegetable oil is really healthy and good because they put a nice picture of a corn or a nice picture of vegetables. But the problem is that these are actually very, very highly processed oils. So the thing about corn oil, for instance, is that corn is not fatty at all. Okay, so it has to undergo substantial amounts of processing to get that oil out. Not only that, you have to take tons and tons of corn to get that bottle of oil, because corn is not oily in the least. So if you compare that to olive oil or avocado oil, for instance, or coconut oil, those are fatty fruits. They don't undergo processing. You take the olive or you take the coconut, you squish it, and the oil comes out. That's pretty much it. And our bodies have been adapted to handle that, because you're not processing that in a kind of an industry. And compare that to what they do to get corn and canola oil. That is, you take the seeds, you heat it up, and then you press it. So it gets fed into this screw press with pressures up to 20,000 kilopascals. Then they throw in some hexane, which is a petroleum derivative, and it's a solvent, and it helps dissolve the oil, and then you recover the hexane by distilling. Then you take out the solvent, the hexane, then you refine it. You heat the oil again to 85, you throw in sodium hydroxide, soap forms, and you remove the soap with a centrifuge. Then you degum it, you heat it up again, you steam it, treat it with acid and these so-called gums, phosphatides. Then you bleach it, then you deodorize it with citric acid, and you steam it in a vacuum over high heat. And then they call it all healthy, all natural vegetable oil. But the truth is that this is a highly processed, highly industrialized oil. There's nothing natural about corn oil. There's nothing natural about canola oil. There was never anything natural about it, as opposed to these other traditional oils. You take the olive, you squish it, oil comes out. That's what happens. You take corn, you squish it, nothing oily comes out. You eat corn, you can't taste anything oily about it, right? It's not an oily fruit, and our bodies are simply not designed to handle these industrial oils. And if you look at the omega-6s, of course, the corn oil is the worst of them. But what we think are quite highly inflammatory, which are these omega-6s, are found in most of these industrial vegetable oils. And what you can actually start to see is some studies coming out that show that these polyunsaturated fatty acids, the vegetable oils which we thought were protective, are not at all. So if you look at the Sydney Diet Heart Study, so this came out in the British Medical Journal in 2013, and if you look at the intervention, so they took people and changed their saturated fats for vegetable oils, basically. And what they did was they look at their deaths, and they seem to have a much higher rate of death, and they also seem to have a much higher rate of heart disease. When you compare those people, when you take them in an experiment, you take them, change their saturated fat for vegetable oils. So the death rate was 17.6% versus 11.8%. In other words, about a 5-6% increased risk of death, like a huge increased risk of death when you switch to vegetable oils. This was the biggest study that was ever done, and this was a study done in the, I think it was done in the 70s, but it didn't get published until the 90s. And it was a 40% fat diet, which is fairly standard for most American diets. And they replaced the saturated fat, again, with polyunsaturated fats. And this was done actually in a mental institution where they controlled the diet. So that's very interesting, and they followed them for about 5 years. And what they found was that you could not show any difference in terms of the heart disease rate, but if you look at death rates, they were actually substantially higher. So this is the treatment arm, and this is the percent alive. And you can see that there's less people alive when you change people from saturated acid to the vegetable oils. So they were dying more. And when you take a look, and this is another recent study done in 2013, and they looked at all the studies, that they broke them up because the omega-3s might be protective, but it's also a polyunsaturated fat. They broke them up in terms of the studies that had omega-6s, or the vegetable oils, there seemed to be a lot of increased risk compared to the ones that used the omega-3, where you could see that there actually seems to be a substantial protection. So when you look at all studies with these polyunsaturated, there seems to be no benefit overall, but that's not quite the whole story. So the omega-3s seem to be protective, but the omega-6s, the vegetable oils, are actually quite harmful. There's also interesting studies looking at homicide. Some people think it actually plays an important role in homicide and mental health, and some people have linked increasing homicide rates to the consumption of these vegetable oils. I'm not quite sure that that is true, but nevertheless, people have also linked it to depression. Again, I'm not sure that that's true, or whether that's simply a reflection of the fact that they are highly industrialized nations, which tend to get more of these diseases. But certainly if you look at risk of dying and you look at the tissue levels of these polyunsaturated fats, as you have more and more of these omega-6s in your tissues, the risk of dying goes up. Okay, so there's a clear correlation. So all these people in Greenland and Japan and so on who have very low levels of these omega-6s. So omega-6 is the one that's in the vegetable oil. You tend to have very low risk of dying. And the ones who have a lot of omega-6s tend to have the highest risk of dying. So if we go to low-fat diets, we see that even if you think about it, there may not be as much protection as you might think. But you might think, well, where's all this data coming from that led us to believe that low-fat diets were really good for you? And the funny part is that you actually can't find it. So one of the studies that was supposed to show that low-fat diet was really good for you was Mr. Fit. And they actually told people to do a lot of things other than eating a low-fat diet. They actually had a group 12,000 men with high cholesterol, and one group lived normally, and one group had this so-called special intervention. So they quit smoking, they lowered their blood pressure, and they ate a low-fat diet because they thought that was really good for you at the time. Of course, the quitting smoking and the lowering the blood pressure, that was good for you. So you could show that you could lower the cholesterol a little bit. So the special intervention group, this is their cholesterol, they did lower the cholesterol a bit. But the problem is if you look at the number of deaths, there doesn't seem to be any difference between the two. So even though you're following all those important things, you couldn't show any difference. Actually, I'll take questions at the end, if you don't mind. I'll just finish this. The biggest study that was done was the Women's Health Initiative, which was a huge study. So 48,835 women. They followed them over 8.1 years. And this is an experiment. So they actually took almost 50,000 women. And one group they said, okay, eat the regular way that you do. And the other group they told, okay, eat a low-fat diet, so 20% of calories, which is very low. Eat more grains and eat more vegetables and fruit. And they looked at several things. One is that this is the diet from fat. So you can see the regular group did eat a bit of lower fat, but the group they told to eat really low fat, they actually ate a very low-fat diet. So that's good. If you look at the number of fruits and vegetables, they told them to eat more fruits and vegetables. They did eat more fruits and vegetables. So that's very good. Was there any benefit? Well, you couldn't really find any benefit. So this is heart attacks, death, and coronary heart disease. There's no difference between the two groups. There's also no difference in strokes. So if you look at strokes, the two groups show no difference between the two groups. So one group was following a very so-called good diet, which is the low-fat diet, but there was no benefit whatsoever. If you look at breast cancer and invasive colorectal cancer, you'll see the same thing. Even there was a suggestion, but there really wasn't any benefit that they could show. In this humongous study of 50,000 patients, they couldn't show any benefit. So if you think about the fat, they actually might be protective even within the context of the insulin, because the one thing that the fats do is that they tend to reduce the insulin levels. So if you eat fatty foods, it actually slows down your digestion. And you know that because you eat a very fatty meal and you go, oh, it just kind of sits there, right? Because it slows down the digestion. It slows down your intestines. And what you can see if you look at this study, if you look at the insulin rise, so they gave people kind of 4 different diets, but what's important is this one. So you give carbohydrates, which is CHO, or you give the carbohydrate with the fat. And what you can see is that whether you look at glucose or insulin, if you take the carbohydrate by itself, so that's bread and pasta and so on, you have a very high spike in your glucose and a very high spike in your insulin. But if you take the carbohydrate with the fat, it really attenuates the rise in glucose as well as the rise in insulin. So that's actually a very good thing. If you look at the glucose response again, it seems to be much better comparing the one with just the carbohydrate to the one with carbohydrate with fat. So the Mediterranean diet, for instance, is actually not a low-fat diet, it's a high-fat diet. Like you take their bread, yes, but they're going to take it with all that olive oil and vinegar, both of which are actually protective factors. The Lyon Diet Heart Study, which looked at this Mediterranean diet, showed that if you take people 5 years out, they took 600 patients, and they assigned them to the American Heart Association diet versus a Mediterranean diet, what you found was that the experimental diet, people seemed to do a lot better. That is, the benefit to them was that the risk of cardiovascular death was reduced by 75%. So actually a huge difference between this. This is the percent without events, cardiovascular events. So if you take the Mediterranean diet, you have significant protection. And this is more data on the Mediterranean diet. So this was just published actually in 2013 in the New England Journal of Medicine. So the controlled diet, this is 7,400 patients, 4.8 years of follow-up, and what you can see is that the Mediterranean diet, or the Mediterranean diet which emphasizes nuts, and one which emphasizes extra virgin olive oil, they do much better than the control diet, which is a standard low-fat diet. And one of the main things of this is the fat, that is the olive oil or the nuts, both of which are highly fatty foods. So if you want to try and understand it in the context, what it is this. So things still seem to be based on the insulin level. But you can see that the major two protective factors are the fiber, so natural carbohydrates, unrefined carbohydrates, broccoli and whole grains and those sort of things, package the carbohydrate with a lot of fiber. And because the fiber reduces the insulin, it doesn't seem to have any bad effect. When you take out all the fiber with processing, and you turn it into flour, or you turn it into a cake, or a donut, or bread, that's where you get just the carbohydrate, but not the fiber. So you lose all that protection. The fiber acts almost as an antidote. Fat does the same thing. So natural fats, not vegetable oils and trans fats, but natural fats do the same thing. What they do is that they reduce the insulin levels. They reduce the spike in the insulin levels. So taking a high-fat meal, for instance, is not actually bad for you. It actually might be significantly protective because of this effect on insulin levels. And so this is how we can understand it, and how you can understand things like the Mediterranean diet and why they're protective and that sort of thing. So it's still, the key player is still the insulin levels. The insulin levels is what drives everything. It drives the metabolic syndrome, it drives heart disease, it drives stroke, it drives cancer. There are things that tend to increase the insulin levels, particularly the carbohydrates, particularly wheat. Protein can also do it. Insulin resistance also drives high insulin levels, but that's a time-dependent effect. And the fructose, which is the sugars, tend to play directly into the insulin resistance. So the sugars is bad two ways. One is that it plays directly into insulin resistance, as well as a carbohydrate. And there are certain factors which are protective that you need to emphasize. And by emphasizing those things, you can see that there's multiple studies that show that protection leads not only through to hypertension and metabolic syndrome, but all the way to heart disease as well. The low-fat diet. So what we've done, if you think about the last 30 years, we've gone from kind of traditional diets where we eat a lot of whole foods and fatty foods and that sort of thing. And we've done two things, right? One is that we've increased the amount of processing in the diet, and that's really just as a matter of convenience, right? Instead of buying things whole and cooking them, we prefer to buy them in a box and it'd take 2 minutes to cook instead, right? Or it's ready to eat right out of the thing. The processing, though, of course, strips out all the fat and strips out all the fiber, because the fat goes bad, so you have much less shelf life, and the fiber people just don't like to eat. So people don't have any of that. The other thing that we've done is that we've told people to eat a low-fat diet. So instead of getting the protective effect of the fat, we've gone to a low-fat diet. And the other thing that was bad about the low-fat diet, of course, is that you wind up emphasizing these carbohydrates. So not only are you taking more of these, because now instead of eating a piece of steak or a fatty piece of meat, you're going to eat fat-free pasta. right? So what you do is you eat a lot of these carbohydrates which raise your insulin level at the very same time that you've reduced all your protective factors. So you've reduced the fiber, you've reduced the fat, you've taken more of these carbohydrates, and if you remember, the American Heart Association and so on for a while was saying you could eat as much sugar as you want. They didn't really care, as long as you didn't eat fat. So we're eating more of the carbohydrates, we're eating more of the sugars, and we're reducing the fiber and the fat. And therefore, the insulin levels were just skyrocketing, which led over time to the insulin resistance, and then people wonder, why are you getting all this metabolic syndrome? Well, the answer is obvious. The insulin levels are skyrocketing. You've reduced all the factors that protect you, and all of a sudden now, everybody practically has diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, high cholesterol. Which is great for the drug companies. They make a lot of money on this sort of stuff because they sell you all these drugs to take care of your blood pressure, your diabetes, your high cholesterol, but nobody ever talks to you about the insulin levels and how that really was the real cause of it, and that is really what needs to be reduced. When you can reduce that, that is when you start to get a lot of protection. And you take care of all these problems with drugs, but the problem is that you still have the high insulin levels, which leads to all these problems. I think that's my last slide, so I'll take any questions. You had a question, Mr. Ali?